Good morning. In our series about heroes of faith, we come to Esther. Her story is set in Persia, in a much later period of history than many of our other Old Testament heroes. The book of Esther begins with these words: "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. By the 5th century before Christ, there was no kingdom of Israel. The Jews who lived in Persia had been forced to move there and to Mesopotamia by the Babylonians. By the time of Esther, they lived there as a subject people of the vast empire of the Medes and Persians. In the city of Susa, the empire's capital, Emperor Xerxes is celebrating with a big party in the imperial palace. It says, for a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendour and glory of his majesty. The wine flowed freely, and the nobles drank from gold goblets. When the party was over, the emperor gave another party. Having presumably run through all the normal party entertainment, he sent one of his top eunuchs with orders to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown. He wanted to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Queen Vashti was giving her own banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. She refused to come. Xerxes was furious that his queen had embarrassed him in front of his nobles. He went ballistic and actually made a new law that no one was to be allowed into his presence unless they were sent for by the emperor. In future, anyone who entered the emperor's presence without being invited, and this included the queen, would be put to death. When he had calmed down a bit, Xerxes looked for a new queen. His advisors came up with the idea of a nationwide beauty contest, with contestants from all 127 provinces of the empire. A young girl called Esther was quickly declared the winner. Surprisingly, after a beauty contest, Esther was liked by everybody, including the other contestants, having got top marks for personality as well as beauty. The emperor made her his queen and presented her with a crown. However, Esther had a secret. She was Jewish, brought up by her cousin Mordecai of the tribe of Benjamin. Mordecai told her not to reveal that she was not a member of the ruling class of Medes and Persians. Actually, as a Jew, Mordecai was not even allowed to enter the imperial palace, but every day he hovered around the gateway, keeping an eye on Esther and picking up all the palace gossip. On one occasion he learned that 2 nobles were plotting to assassinate the emperor. He passed this on to Esther, so the plot was discovered, and Mordecai was remembered in dispatches in the imperial archive. But Mordecai was quickly forgotten and returned to his hovering at the royal palace. Meanwhile, a noble called Haman became the emperor's chief advisor. Xerxes was considered as a god by his people, so everyone came to regard Haman as next to God and bowed down to the ground when Haman passed by. Everyone, that is, except Mordecai, who did not bow down. Interestingly, we're not told why he didn't bow down, but the clue is perhaps in the fact that God is not mentioned once in the 10 chapters of Esther. Perhaps that is to highlight the fact that it was forbidden in the capital of the Persian Empire to worship anyone other than their god, probably the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, and his servant, the Emperor Xerxes. Mordecai's lack of respect made Haman furious. It was now his turn to go ballistic. Hiding his anger, he craftily persuaded Emperor Xerxes that all the Jewish people in the Persian Empire were dangerous traitors and should be killed. Haman drew up a plan that on a certain day the imperial army should destroy all the Jews. Orders under the emperor's seal were sent to all 127 provinces. The plan for the annihilation of the Jews was, of course, kept secret. However, hovering around the palace gate, Mordecai caught wind of it. The next time he went to the palace gate, he wore sackcloth and ashes. When Esther heard about Mordecai's strange behaviour, she was naturally worried about him and sent a trusted servant to find out what was the matter. Mordecai furnished him with details of the plot, together with a copy of the secret instructions to exterminate the Jews. They even had government leaks in those days. When Esther learned about the plan to exterminate all the Jews in the empire, she was horrified. She was equally horrified when her uncle told her to go to her husband Xerxes and beg him not to exterminate her people. Because actually, Esther was no born hero like David. She sent a message to Mordecai pointing out the difficulty of her position. All the king's officials and the people of the most of the royal provinces, put my teeth in, know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Mordecai sent back a message confronting the queen with the reality of the situation. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? The popular girl, up to now living a life of ease and luxury, suddenly changes, recognizing perhaps for the first time the depth of her responsibility. She sends these words to Mordecai: Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. At this point, I've only got to chapter 4 out of the 10 chapters of the book of Esther, which I urge you to read if you've not read it, because in many ways it is one of the best told stories in the Bible. So to cut a long story short, the prayers of the Jews of Susa were answered. The emperor listened to Esther. He sent out a new decree to every province, alerting the Jews to the imminent attack and giving them authority to arm and defend themselves. The evil Haman, who had been plotting to execute Mordecai, was himself found guilty of treason and executed. Mordecai and Esther were the joint heroes of the day, or now technically the 2 days of the Jewish festival of Purim, where these events are still celebrated. The Jewish festival of Purim exists in the world today even after 2,500 years. Fascinating though it is, there isn't the time to explore or even continue the story from chapter 5 to chapter 10. This is a shame because the story is surprisingly funny, despite its grim background. In fact, it is so artfully written that we can enjoy the story so much that we can miss the point, or rather the many points the author of Esther was making about God. Yet this is the only book in the Bible which never mentions God. We get a hint of why when we remember that the Jews, or for that matter any non-Persians, were not allowed to enter the royal palace. And Mordecai had warned Esther to keep quiet about her Jewish ancestors. Perhaps surprisingly, it had been the emperor's ancestor, King Cyrus, who had originally allowed some of the Jews to return to Jerusalem. But in Susa, it was a different matter. The God of the Jews was not to be mentioned. So how could the Jews still honour God in this hostile environment? Very carefully. Mordecai kept his ears to the ground and as close as he could to the royal palace. Early in the story, when he heard of a plot against the emperor, he was able to get information to Xerxes through Esther. But while Mordecai publicly kept quiet about his faith, he drew red lines that he would not cross. For instance, he would not bow down to Haman. This was dangerous and very nearly led to his death. But he had clearly decided he would bow down only to God. Mordecai didn't act alone. He worked with and advised Queen Esther, and they both drew on the prayer support of many others. What is remarkable about Esther is that she was a reluctant hero. Safe in the heart of the palace, she had probably not had to draw red lines around her faith in the way Mordecai had. Then, out of the blue, she was faced with a terrifying challenge: the planned destruction of the Jewish people throughout the empire, spelled out in the emperor's sealed orders. We might compare those orders with the railway timetables which document the destruction of 6 million Jews in Nazi Europe in the 1940s, or the simple instructions given to cleaver-wielding militias in Rwanda in the mid-1990s that resulted in the murder of 800,000 people. Terrifying. Yet, with the trust in God Esther had learned from Mordecai and the secret prayers of her people, she risked her life by approaching Emperor Xerxes uninvited. In the latter chapters of the book of Esther, we read how, having received the nerve to do this, she then coolly planned and brought about the ruin of the evil Haman. Unlike many heroes of faith, Esther was a reluctant hero. One of the first things modern heroes say, the ones you see being interviewed on the telly today, is, "I'm not a hero." Esther was leading a good life and a happy one. Suddenly, catastrophe. She was faced with annihilation. How would she react to her whole world being destroyed in an instant? In her case, her cousin was there to remind her who was really always in charge of her life. And who knows, as Mordecai said, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Perhaps we need to draw red lines like Mordecai did. For example, perhaps there are behaviours in others and in ourselves that we need to challenge. Perhaps when we pray that God will deliver us from evil, we need to make a mental note that this requires us to face the challenge of evil when it presents itself. Like the nurse who killed all those babies, evil sometimes hides itself in plain sight. So for that, and many reasons, we need to be on our guard. As Mordecai says, who knows? Any one of us might find ourselves becoming a reluctant hero like Esther.